Hey guys, today I'm going to talk about difficulty burnouts. Difficulty burnouts are essentially the result of players getting frustrated by a game's difficulty, and this leads to them quickly becoming disengaged from the game. It is pretty common for games to suffer from this issue, and it is usually due to careless design. However, many games manage to circumvent this issue, and in this video I'm going to explain how they do it. Now it goes without saying that game theory and player empathy is important when designing a game. But what many developers seem to forget is the importance of giving players control, as a lot of games have the tendency to take control away from the player in varying quantities, and they do so for various reasons. One example of how a game takes control away from the player is the act of reloading a weapon. This disables the player's ability to shoot temporarily until the animation of reloading has been completed. Other examples of how games take control away from the player are recovery time, staggering, delays, and stun effects. When these are applied to the player, players feel powerless against their adversary, and this can become one of the many causes of difficulty burnouts. Now don't get me wrong, I understand that games require the implementation of stun effects and recovery time for balancing reasons, and to prevent them from performing exploits. As for staggering, I believe that games use it as a means of making the impact of hitting a target more satisfying and more effective to give players a sense of power. When applied to the player, however, it can prove to be somewhat irritating, as players lose control completely when this happens. Therefore, it is recommended that developers cut down the amount of time these effects occur to the player in order to maximize speed. This is very important, especially in a real-time game where time is a resource, as players who are unable to control themselves have to spend time for the ability to do so, and if this causes them to get a game over, they are far more likely to blame the game rather than themselves. Personally, I find that delays and reloading are completely useless, as their only purpose is to take control away from the player. The only reason reloading exists is because of realism, and as we all know by now, realism should never be applied to game design. As for delays, I find it hard to see a reason to implement them. Perhaps they are implemented for balancing reasons, but even so, I still think that there are better ways to balance a set of abilities. Regardless, these are but mere examples of how games take control away from the player, and why it is so frustrating. The purpose of this is to help developers understand why players are being frustrated, not to tell them to avoid it completely, just to be aware of it and take action where it is necessary. Because taking control away from the player essentially takes them away from the game itself, as if they aren't able to control anything, they aren't playing a game. Remember that frustration is the cause of most difficulty burnouts, and this causes players to become disengaged from your game. Another thing to note when it comes to difficulty burnouts is fatiguing due to the brutal nature of difficulty curves. Now, a lot of people advocate for the idea of a difficulty curve, and I'm not one of those people. Sure, the difficulty in games should go up as players progress, but for the sake of engagement, I think it's important to ease the difficulty down a little at certain points. This is what I like to call breather levels, and to explain what a breather level is, I'm going to use one as an example. In Painkiller there is a level named Asylum. Asylum is arguably the best example of what makes a successful breather level. It is important to remember that the idea of a breather level is to give players a chance to recharge without compromising their momentum, and Asylum does this perfectly. In fact, Asylum goes above and beyond what a breather level should, as it encourages players to approach the level slightly differently than the previous levels, as this level is a lot tighter than the previous levels. This means that players will not have as much freedom to move around like they did in previous levels, forcing them to manage their movement more diligently. However, unlike the previous level, Opera House, where players are forced to contend with projectile-based enemies and deadly melee enemies, Asylum only has melee enemies to contend with. This drastically alters the player's method of play, as now they no longer have to avoid projectiles with timed movement, allowing them to essentially take a break from dealing with projectile enemies. Despite this, however, the enemies in the Asylum level aren't as simple as the ones fought in Cemetery. The amputees found in the Asylum level may not have projectile attacks, but they have a deadly leaping attack, and they can leap at players from a surprisingly long distance. This means that players need to be constantly aware of what is around them. Therefore, the intensity of the gameplay is maintained, despite the lowering of difficulty. This allows players to recharge after the previous level, whilst giving players something new to learn so that they can play the game more effectively later on. On top of all this, the Asylum level is noticeably darker and eerier than previous levels, to create a tense atmosphere, making players feel uneasy despite the fact that the level is considerably easier than the previous two levels. This is why the Asylum level in Painkiller is such a masterpiece of level design that few people appreciate. In any case, the point is that through the use of what I like to call difficulty waves, games can provide a difficult challenge without being too overwhelming. Put simply, the wave should start out at the bottom end of the difficulty scale, slowly go up, then slightly go back down, then slowly go back up, and so on and so forth. Over time, the waves will gradually rise up higher, much like if you were to swim out into the open sea, and this is where the game would offer the challenge that players yearn for, without being too overwhelming for the player. I believe this design theory is overlooked, and is very effective. Painkiller executes this theory extremely well for the most part. Finally, should a player be defeated, go easy on them. Don't punish them too harshly, and always leave a window of opportunity for the player to bounce back. When players are defeated in Manta Blade Warband, they are taken prisoner and lose a few items along with many of their men. They will eventually be released from imprisonment, and will be able to continue playing as well as keep the levels that the player has accumulated over the course of the game. This punishment may be harsh, but it still makes it possible for players to bounce back should they build their army back up and try again. In addition, make sure there are checkpoints after overcoming a major obstacle in the game. Do note that this does not include breakpoints, as breakpoints should be provided as a means for players to pull out satisfied. There needs to be checkpoints in between breakpoints so that players maintain some of their progress. That way, they do not feel as if their time has been wasted. It amazes me to this day how so many games fail to offer checkpoints. Now, a lot of people look at gaming today and see it as being too easy. The truth is that games aren't getting easier, they're becoming more accessible, and players that consider games to be too easy were brought up in the arcade era of gaming, where games were designed around coin-operative machines that required players to spend real money if they ran out of continues. This caused developers at the time to make games harder for the sake of making more money. Nowadays, games need to be accessible, not just to attract a wider audience, like many people claim, but also because accessibility keeps players from becoming disengaged, and prevents them from wasting time failing at a level. Time that could be spent elsewhere. If players aren't making progression, they will want to disconnect themselves from your game. Video games are more than a means of challenging players. They are an experience, and players want to enjoy their experience, not be frustrated by it. I hope this video has been valuable to you, and I'll see you guys next time.